So the situation in Austria now, just to bring you some breaking news from the UK. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been admitted to intensive care with those persistent symptoms of coronavirus. So just breaking news coming into us within the past few seconds. The Prime Minister has been under the care of doctors in a hospital in London, and he is being now admitted into intensive care with those persistent symptoms of coronavirus. He has been in hospital since Sunday evening. We were expecting him to stay in the hospital for a second night in this hospital, St Thomas's Hospital. But we heard earlier on from his tweet that he was doing well, and we heard also from Dominic Raab earlier on that he was still very much in charge of what was happening. Now, Laura Kuenssberg, our political editor, joins me live on the line now. Laura, a very worrying development now about the British Prime Minister.
Hello, Kasia. Yes, just in the last few minutes, we've had an official statement from Downing Street after very, very little information through the day. That at around 7 o'clock tonight, as I understand it, the Prime Minister was taken to intensive care. The statement makes clear that he, is receiving excellent care, and he wants to thank all the people at the NHS. But something important has changed in that he's now in intensive care rather than being looked after by medics, and he's felt it necessary to ask the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, to deputise for him where needs be. Now, that's a completely different message to what we've heard in the last sort of 18 hours or so, where it was continually the Prime Minister's in touch, he's still in charge, everything is sort of almost as business as usual. Clearly now the Prime Minister being in intensive care changes everything. His condition, as I understand it, worsened over the course of this afternoon. He's still conscious, we're told, but he's been moved to intensive care as a precaution in case he requires ventilation as necessary to get through this illness.
Really difficult news to hear, Laura. We heard your question actually earlier on during that daily press briefing, and you asked whether if the Prime Minister, if he was not well enough to come out of hospital, was he well enough to govern the country? As you were saying, the government very much saying that he was in charge. Of course, that is absolutely, it cannot be sustainable with this latest development. Well,
that's right. And as I say, with those sort of very sporadic small bits of information that we've had through the day, it seems somewhat of a vacuum, to be honest. And talking to people in government who would normally be quite forthcoming about what was going on was a very, very rigid script, just that he was in good spirits and he was working was sort of cracking on as best he could be, and he was said to be in good spirits. That changed very dramatically in the last 10 minutes. But also there's something slightly more puzzling, whereas at the press conference earlier this afternoon, the Foreign Secretary said he hadn't spoken to the Prime Minister since Saturday. Now, that seemed strange, that seemed rather odd, given that Dominic Raab was meant to be taking charge of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister is continually in touch. Clearly, at that point, the situation was already getting worse. As we then latterly discovered just after 8 o'clock, the Prime Minister has in fact been moved to intensive care.
Now, we know that from a spokesperson from Number 10 that the Prime Minister is receiving excellent care, and they want to pass on their thanks to all the NHS staff for their hard work and their dedication. And as you were saying, he's been in St Thomas's Hospital in London since Sunday evening. Of course, it's very difficult situation given the seriousness of coronavirus itself. But in terms of the detail of his condition, we just simply don't know.
We don't know, and we were told last night, about 24 hours ago, that he was just having routine tests now. But we've struggled to get Downing Street to tell us through the day what those tests were for. And we know that, it's been more than 10 days, 11 days that he's had persistent symptoms of coronavirus and high temperature and a persistent cough. All we know at the moment is that his condition worsened over the course of this afternoon. Therefore, this decision has been made as a precaution to him being in intensive care tonight. So clearly, it's a very serious situation for the Prime Minister of Downing Street, emphasising that this still is a precaution. But it's obviously a huge moment. I mean, when he was taken to hospital last night, that was obviously a real milestone in the way this whole crisis has unfolded. And, so many people who weren't right in the heart of government have been hit by this. But to have the Prime Minister in intensive care at a time when the country is trying to respond to an emergency, the government is trying to get through an emergency for the nation's health and the economy, it really is a worrying development. And I think something that will come as a surprise. I was talking to the cabinet ministers about this morning, and a couple of them sounded quite relaxed. One said, I'm glad he's gone to go and have a proper rest. He's been a bit like an alpha male and refused to stop working. But this obviously is a very different situation now.
Extremely different situation, Laura. We see, and you talk about him continuously working. Just 6 hours ago, I'm just on his Twitter feed, he was tweeting about the advice last night. On the advice of my doctor, Boris Johnson tweeted, I went into hospital for some routine tests. I'm still experiencing coronavirus symptoms. I'm in good spirits and keeping in touch with my team as we work together to fight this virus and keep everyone safe. So only 6 hours ago was he very much keeping everybody up to date, as he has been over the few days when we initially heard about his symptoms with those little video messages that we're watching now from a couple of days ago. So very difficult now to understand that he is now in intensive care. For anybody just joining us, just to restate that Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, has been admitted into intensive care. A spokesperson for Number 10 saying that he is receiving excellent care and passing on thanks to all the NHS staff for their hard work and their dedication. But Laura, this for the United Kingdom, we heard the Queen making a statement to the nation just yesterday. This is a devastating blow.
It's certainly a very sad turn in all of this, of course, and rather an unexpected one. And we will just have to see in the coming days. I mean, Downing Street is firm tonight. This has happened as a precaution. It doesn't, mean more than necessarily than they've said, that they've moved him in order that if he requires ventilation as his condition progresses, he's in the right place to do that. But it obviously is a very serious moment. And we don't know what comes next, other than the Prime Minister has asked Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, actually to deputise for him, giving up any sort of pretense that he's somehow able to mind the shop when he's battling this illness.
And we heard Dominic Raab take on this daily press statement that we're seeing every day now since lockdown. We're seeing these daily press conferences. Dominic Raab gave his today. I know you posed the first question in this daily press conference. He wants to show that the Prime Minister was very much in control. That situation will inevitably change. But Dominic Raab now, the man at the helm of the British government.
Indeed, and for the time being, Dominic Raab, who has the official title, not just as Foreign Secretary, but as First Secretary of State now in the UK, that means someone basically is a sort of de facto deputy. They're like the official understudy. For him, obviously, this is also a huge moment. He already this morning chaired the government's coronavirus daily sort of emergency meeting that they've been holding every morning at 9:15. But at that point, it really didn't seem as if he would actually be taking on some of the roles. Now, there was some chatter this afternoon amongst Tory MPs that I was talking to who were unhappy that the Prime Minister wasn't stepping back further in order actually to get better. Now, of course, that choice has actually been taken out of his hands.
So when it comes to the way that, because it's important to stress that we don't have a deputy prime minister in this country, as you were outlining the role of Dominic Raab, but Boris Johnson didn't choose a deputy. So that, I guess, it shows how in control he was and wanted to be seen to be. But in a situation like this, it complicates what is already a terribly complicated situation.
Yes, although in the UK it doesn't always work. There isn't, sort of strictly speaking, there isn't a vice president role or anything like that. There tends to be somebody who sort of acts as if what we would call the sort of de facto PM. There is that rather grand-sounding title, the First Secretary of State. Somebody who is able to deputise in particular circumstances at Prime Minister's questions, for example. But you're right, it is a sort of quirk of British politics that there isn't this sort of official deputy position in the way that there is in other countries.
And Laura, of course, we Just hearing this hearing within just the past few moments, in fact, we're coming to terms with it. The fact that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been taken into intensive care in hospital with coronavirus. The Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab now deputising for him. Just even hours before, Boris Johnson tweeting that his spirits were up. When it comes to what we know, it's very limited in terms of his condition. He wasn't looking fantastic during the Thursday night's clap for the NHS, and it sounds, well, he was. Some were saying that he wasn't looking great. He was looking a little bit tired, but he did come out and clap the care workers, the NHS workers, very much doing his part to keep morale up.
Yes, and the Prime Minister was still popping up to try to sort of have a glimpse of being seen publicly. But as you say, it was perfectly clear in those brief glimpses that he had been struggling to shake this illness off, that he was working from an self-isolation in the flat in Downing Street where he was chairing meetings by a video link. But now, staying at home in Downing Street with being looked after and trying to rest up there was clearly not enough for the way that the illness has progressed for him in the last few days.
Laura Kuensberg, our political editor, thank you so much. So just to remind viewers joining us at the moment, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been taken into intensive care with coronavirus. The Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab will be deputising for the Prime Minister. I can bring you a statement from number 10, from 10 Downing Street. Since Sunday evening, the Prime Minister has been under the care of doctors at St Thomas's Hospital in central London after being admitted with persistent symptoms of coronavirus. Over the course of this afternoon, the condition of the Prime Minister has worsened, and the statement goes on to say that on the advice of his medical team, he has been moved to the intensive care unit at the hospital. The Prime Minister has asked the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who is the first Secretary of State, to deputise for him where necessary. The PM is receiving excellent care and thanks all NHS staff for their hard work and their dedication. That is a statement from number 10 Downing Street, a spokesperson speaking on behalf, giving that statement. That since Sunday, the Prime Minister has been under the care of doctors at St Thomas's Hospital in London, and just reiterating that he is receiving excellent care and wanting to thank all the NHS staff for their hard work and their dedication, something that the Prime Minister himself did, standing outside number 10 Downing Street, clapping for the NHS workers, those frontline workers, clapping for the care workers and all the key workers who are on the front line of this pandemic, which has now taken the Prime Minister, has now led him to be in intensive care. So that breaking news that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is he has been moved in intensive care after spending since Sunday evening, after being in St Thomas's Hospital, having shown symptoms of coronavirus. But just even 7 hours ago, looking at his Twitter feed, he was tweeting that on the advice of my doctor, that he went into hospital. He described them as routine tests. 7 hours ago, the Prime Minister describing his admittance into St Thomas's Hospital as going in for routine tests because he was still experiencing those coronavirus symptoms that we've been hearing about over the past few days. And he stated that I'm in good spirits, I'm keeping in touch with my team, we are working together to fight this virus and to keep everyone safe. And he added that he wanted to thank all the brilliant staff taking care of him and others in this difficult time. In his tweet, he said, "You are the best of Britain." He said, "Stay safe, everyone. Please remember to stay at home to protect the NHS and to save lives." And just yesterday, in fact, he said, "Thank you for doing your bit in the fight against coronavirus," stressing stay home, protect the NHS and save lives. Of course, there was a lot of concern over the weekend with the temperatures here in the UK reaching their 20s, that it would be a beautiful day with people really eager to go outside. But the Prime Minister stressing to everybody on Sunday, the 5th of April, stay home, protect the NHS and save lives. And he is now in the hands of the NHS. He is in intensive care after having spent since Sunday evening at St Thomas's Hospital in central London. And just earlier on today, he had described this in a tweet as going in for routine tests because he was experiencing those coronavirus symptoms, and just stressing that he is in good spirits, keeping in touch with his team, working together to fight this virus and keeping everyone safe. So that is the tweet that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, posted 7 hours ago on his Twitter feed, describing that decision to go into hospital as being routine, to go in for routine tests because of those concerns of the coronavirus symptoms that we've been hearing about the Prime Minister having experienced for a number of days. But as you can see, in his own words, he said that I'm keeping in good spirits, keeping in touch with my team as we work together to fight this virus in order to keep everyone safe. He also added his thanks, that he wanted to say thank you to all the brilliant NHS staff who are taking care of him and others in this difficult time. He added, "You are the best of Britain." And of course, just adding as well, stay safe, everyone. Please remember to stay at home to protect the NHS and save lives. The UK now entering its third week of lockdown. We can cross over to speak to Ian Duncan-Smith, who joins us on the telephone now. Your initial reactions on this news that the British Prime Minister is in intensive care?
Well, I'm shocked. I suspect, like anybody else, he's a friend, and as Prime Minister, it's a bad moment in a sense. Because obviously for anybody, but particularly him, because I know him very well. So I'm deeply saddened, really, that it should have come to this. He's obviously worked like mad to try and get through this, but it's not been enough so far. But that doesn't mean necessarily that he isn't going to pull through this, because they may have put him on intensive care because they can treat him, and he may have a secondary infection, a serious chest infection, and that will stabilise him so they can get after it and get him through this and out the other side much quicker and in a more stable way. So let's hope and pray that Boris is obviously in the best of hands and will pull through.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, of course, we don't know exactly the condition that he's in. We haven't had that much detail. Earlier on today, the Prime Minister tweeted that he had gone in, he was admitted to hospital last night for routine tests. We don't know the exact condition he is in, but of course he is now in intensive care. How does the responsibility for governing the country, how will that play out in the next few hours?
Well, first of all, obviously our thoughts are with him and his family. That's the most important thing, because they'll all be worried about this. This is, at the end of the day, a human issue as much as it is to do with a government issue. But as I say, he'll be in great hands, and I know that they will be taking no risks at all, and that's why they've done this, so they can treat him properly and fairly. But in terms of the government, we shouldn't have any concerns at all. It has been known for some considerable time that the Prime Minister appointed Dominic Raab as First Secretary. He is more than capable of fulfilling this role. He has great experience in government and knows exactly what's got to be done. And he will have been brought up to speed with all the key processes that go around the Prime Minister since he became ill, because they will have been planning for this just in case this happened. And of course, then there's all the other cabinet ministers, some of them very senior, like Michael Gove, who will understand this and understand how this works. They've all got jobs to do. Nothing changes in that regard. But what now happens is that they must look to Dominic Raab for that final pivotal decision-making process, whilst the Prime Minister is unable to take that role. But I feel completely confident in the government as it stands tonight. My concerns for Boris Johnson are personal concerns for a good friend.
Of course, we all wish him the best and a speedy recovery. Should he have taken a little bit less of an active role? He was on Twitter earlier on today. Should he have just taken time to get well? Because he's had these symptoms for a number of days now, and they have worsened.
No, I think his first thought has not actually been for himself, has been, in a sense, for the British people. He doesn't want the British people to feel in any way overly concerned and worried. He wants them to be calm, which I think shows the nature of the individual he is. And I think that's what this has all been about. And as I say, we shouldn't overread the going into intensive care. I'm certain that the doctors will have done this to make sure that they can stabilize him completely so that they can treat whatever he may have. As I say, it could be a strong secondary infection, which needs to be treated and treated rather urgently. But that notwithstanding, I think that, the way he sees it is he was elected to be the Prime Minister of a government. He wants to make sure the right decisions are being made. Now, there is a chain of command. That now lies in the hands of Dominic Raab and the rest of the Cabinet. They know what they've got to do. There should be no squabbling. There'll be no discussions. They'll just get on with it as though Boris was there, only this time it'll be Dominic Raab.
Well, in this statement that we've received from Number 10, it stresses that the Prime Minister is receiving excellent care, and they are adding their thanks to all the NHS staff for their hard work and their dedication. It just goes to show that this virus does not discriminate in terms of who the person is. And it's a difficult situation, of course, given that so many people are experiencing symptoms. And I guess the message has to be clear: stay at home, save lives.
This couldn't be a clearer exposition of the whole point of stay home, support the NHS and save lives, because those people who have decided somehow over the last couple of days that they just didn't need to think about this very much, if nothing tells them that there is a purpose to what the government and the medical officers and the scientific officers and the NHS are trying to do, which is to lessen the impact of this ghastly virus and to give everybody a fighting chance of getting through to the other side with an economy intact. And to do that, we need to do what we have been asked, which is to stay at home, to make sure we can't catch the infection and or give it to other people, thus putting extra pressure on the NHS. And if the Prime Minister can come down with this, and the Cabinet Minister, in the case of the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, then people should realise that anybody can get this, and therefore we must take this really carefully. This should be another warning moment. But my thoughts, most of all, tonight are with Boris.
Do you think that the UK was too slow then in its lockdown measures? Were we somewhat misguided by this idea of herd immunity, that we should have got into this a little bit quicker?
No, I think the story about herd immunity was a red herring, if you don't mind me saying so, that got going because people misinterpreted what had been said, I think, by the science advisor, which was that eventually, in all virus outbreaks, people eventually develop an immunity which dampens down the scale of an outbreak. But that is a long time down the road. It was not a matter of policy at all. It was just an observation that eventually, society gets to that point, either through vaccinations or through, infection spreading. But that's not a policy. The policy was from the very beginning to try and stop this from spreading. And that's what the shutdown has been all about in the last 2 weeks. And there is some indication, which I wouldn't overread, but that it may already be beginning to just have that effect. And it is vital we give it its real opportunity to do so.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. And I know that we all wish the Prime Minister the very best. Just to reiterate, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been moved into intensive care after his symptoms for coronavirus had worsened. We've had this statement from Downing Street that over the course of this afternoon, the condition of the Prime Minister has worsened, and on the advice of his medical team, he has been moved to the intensive care unit at the hospital. The Prime Minister has asked the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, who is the first Secretary of State, to deputise for him where necessary. So this is the statement that has been given to us from Downing Street, describing how the condition of the Prime Minister had worsened. He has been at St Thomas Hospital since Sunday evening. We were initially told that he was going in for routine tests. This statement now saying that his condition has worsened and that on the advice of his medical team, He has been moved to the intensive care unit at the hospital. Well, let's speak to my colleague James Gallagher, who is with me now. James, so of course, a very difficult situation for the United Kingdom, just hearing that the British Prime Minister is now in intensive care. But we heard Sir Ian Duncan-Smith say that we don't know exactly the condition that he is in. Talk us through what we know and what this means, being moved into intensive care.
Well, we know that he's had persistent symptoms, particularly of a fever, so a very high temperature, that have persisted longer than what you would normally anticipate, than the usual around about a week that symptoms tend to last. Now, these symptoms seem to have worsened, so he was taken into hospital over the weekend, and then today he has progressed into intensive care. We know some details. We know that the Prime Minister is still conscious, and he is not being ventilated at the moment, but he is in intensive care in case that kind of medical intervention is necessary. Now, it's worth remembering that intensive care is you can have a wide range of conditions within intensive care. So he could just be on, say, oxygen support or very intensive monitoring at this time, because you have to remember that coronavirus is a disease that largely attacks the lungs. So it starts off in many patients as a cough. Now, the overwhelming majority of people recover, but some people do get much worse, and then it can cause symptoms such as shortness of breath. So some patients report or reaching the point where they can't actually even breathe enough to say a few sentences at a time before becoming completely breathless. That's how severe it can become in some patients. Now, those are the ones that will need more intensive support in order to make sure that their lungs are still able to get enough oxygen into the rest of their body. And so Boris Johnson, like other patients with coronavirus on intensive care wards, will be very closely monitored to try to support his body as much as possible. Because once again, we've said it many times, and it's true for Boris Johnson as it is true for other patients. There are no proven drugs at the moment. Many are being researched, but there are no proven drugs that can treat the coronavirus. So you're relying on the basics of medicine, excellent nursing and doctor-led care, but not looking for a drug that is going to be able to change the course of the disease at the moment.
James, you touched upon the oxygen, the kind of process that will happen to somebody who ends up in intensive care. Can you break that down for us a little bit more? What happens when you move potentially from the ward into intensive care? What happens?
Well, it's not as though there is one significant moment. Doctors will be assessing his condition constantly and assessing how that is changing over time. And what you'll see is if any patient's condition worsens, then the number of interventions that you introduce increase. So at the most basic, low levels kind of intervention, you could just be giving oxygen through a tube through the nose to increase the amount of oxygen that he's breathing in so that his lungs can get more oxygen into the rest of his body. And that scales with symptoms. We understand that at the moment the Prime Minister is not requiring ventilation, but you can move through various scales going all the way up through to greater levels of intubation that culminate in more invasive procedures like ventilation, which gets even more oxygen into the body, because that's the crucial bit here. It's about making sure the lungs are functioning well enough to keep enough oxygen in the whole of the body to keep the rest of the organs going.
James, thanks so much for explaining that so clearly. Thank you for the time being. James Gallagher there, my colleague who is with me and will continue to be with me for the next few moments. Just a lot of reaction coming in, of course, to this news that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been moved into intensive care. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon saying that my thoughts are with the Prime Minister and his family, sending him very good wishes. And also NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying my thoughts are with my friend, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Lots of strength, Boris. Get well soon. Well, someone else who we can talk to now is Sonia Purnell, author of Boris Johnson's biography, joining us live on the phone now. Sonia, I'm sure you are sending the good wishes to the Prime Minister as well.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is really deeply shocking news. A friend of ours' wife was recently in ICU, and I know in intensive care unit. I've heard from her husband how really challenging this is, and it is really deeply shocking. And I absolutely send him the very, very best, and his family, his pregnant fiancée. It must just be awful for her.
Yes, of course, we must remember that Boris Johnson is expecting a child. When it comes to, we've seen him up and about. We saw him on Thursday night, the images that we're watching now, clapping all the key workers, the NHS, motivating the country. Even just hours before, earlier on, he was on social media saying that his spirits were good. This will be a devastating blow to him.
Oh, yes, of course. And an extraordinary one. I mean, I was his deputy when we were both reporters way back in the 1990s. I never knew him to be ill. He was actually rather sort of impatient with people who were ill. He does normally have a really robust constitution, I have to say that. And I think this is some people are more prone to things. I think he's someone who has, generally speaking, not been very vulnerable to illness. So it just shows you how pernicious, how toxic, how strong this virus is, and how you have to treat it with absolute respect and take all the precautions necessary. I mean, it is a deeply shocking event, this.
He has wanted to be leader of this country for so long, and now as Prime Minister with a strong majority, there was so much that he had wanted to do. Of course, we wish him the quickest recovery, but this is the whole coronavirus, this global pandemic has stopped the whole world in its tracks. A very difficult situation for the UK and all countries.
Listen, I really think now the government has to be totally straight with us. I watched the coronavirus press conference earlier, and I wanted to be reassured what they said about his condition and what was going on generally. I came away without even knowing that Mr. Johnson was in intensive care, feeling very, very uncertain. They've got to be utterly straight with us now, utterly transparent about what's going on. We need to know much, much more from the government as to where exactly we are on ventilators, on testing, on an exit strategy, on personal protective equipment for health workers, but also supermarket staff, perhaps bus drivers, certainly pharmacists. We need to really feel that someone is getting a grip now. This may finally really be the moment where we need to have a national government. We bring in people who can boost the government. A lot of its key players are now out of action. We need someone, Tony Blair was saying this morning on Today programme that we need a minister who is irresponsible for nothing but ramping up testing. And this is what, I've written about the Second World War, and I'm loath to draw parallels often, but you had Lord Beaverbrook back then who was given the job of boosting aircraft production. He was a huge character, very, very driven, and he managed to make that happen. We need people now to be brought in to do these jobs. Boris Johnson is clearly going to be out of action for some time. He probably should have been out of action sometime earlier to concentrate on getting well. One worries that, of course, that he went on working when he shouldn't have done. You can't do that with this disease. I think I've had it myself in a very mild version. If so, I've been very lucky. I realised then it was very, very difficult to take even the smallest decision, let alone with a temperature as he has had for 10, 11 days, trying to take decisions, life and death decisions for the country. This is a really, really pivotal, appalling moment for this country. We now need people who come in fresh blood, who are well, who are energetic, who aren't tired, who can actually drive this effort forward now. This is an absolute matter of urgency. Bring in perhaps Keir Starmer, the new Labour leader, or David Cameron, perhaps put him to work. Put people with experience of making government departments work. All sorts of names are being mentioned. I actually think we're now at that stage where we have to do that. This is not a normal business as usual day. We have to do something different.
Sonia Purnell, author of Boris Johnson's biography, thank you so much for speaking to me and passing on your thoughts and wishes for a speedy recovery for the Prime Minister, and of course also remembering all those frontline workers, all the NHS staff, also the care workers, everybody just holding the country together during this coronavirus pandemic. Well, we can speak to the Conservative politician, Dr. Andrew Morrison, who is also a doctor. He joins us live now as well. Dr. Morrison, I'm sure you also want to pass on your regards to the Prime Minister.
Look, I really do. Boris has been working heroically over the past several days, despite his deteriorating condition. He is an extraordinary man, and I'm very sure he's going to pull through from this. It's devastating that over the course of the day, clearly he has deteriorated to the point that he has to go now into intensive care. But I don't think we should jump to any conclusions. I suspect the doctors want to monitor him closely in the way that is only really possible on ICU. And I know he's in the very best of hands at St Thomas's. And of course, we all wish him well for a speedy recovery.
Yes, absolutely crucial there to just reiterate that we don't know the exact condition. We just know that the Prime Minister's condition has worsened and that on the advice of his medical team, he's been moved to the intensive care unit at the hospital. And of course, he has been suffering from these symptoms for the past 10 days. When it comes to looking towards the governing of this country, when it comes to the possibility that the Prime Minister should have stepped away a little bit earlier so that he could concentrate on his recuperation, because we saw that he wasn't feeling great even on Thursday when that NHS claparound for the key workers was taking place. Should he have perhaps just focused on getting match fit?
Well, that's not the nature of the man. He's a selfless individual with a very strong sense of public service. So it would not, I don't think, be in his nature to step back. He has been running things, albeit from his sick bed. Clearly, that is no longer going to be possible in the immediate term. And there is a structure in place to deal with that contingency. There always is. And that will now take effect.
And Dr. Morrison, with the messages that we're hearing across the country to stay indoors, I touched upon this already, but it just goes to show that this disease does not discriminate in any way, shape or form.
No, of course it doesn't. And I think Boris would want the message to go out, particularly as we approach the Easter weekend and probably some good weather, that, you know, we need to stay indoors. We need to socially isolate. We need to wash our hands. All of those simple messages we have to do in order to prevent this virus being transmitted. And in order to save lives, it's vitally important we all do that.
Is the message then clear enough? Are the instructions for this lockdown clear enough? Because we still hear people asking, can I go outside for a walk? How long can the walk be? Do we need more precise measures? I know it's very difficult and many people experiencing difficulties, no gardens, no outside space, children in the house. It is not easy, but do the guidelines need to be just that little bit more precise?
Well, it is incredibly difficult, but I have to say from my own observation, I think most people are using their common sense. I've been struck when I've been out on my mandated walk a day at how well people are distancing themselves. So I think the vast majority of people are doing that. But of course, we're in uncharted waters. We've not been here before. And I think people they do have an element of confusion. Of course they do. I have to say the government advice on the gov.uk website is pretty comprehensive. It's pretty good. And I think gives most people the guidance that they need on how they should conduct themselves over the next several days.
And can I just use your expertise as a doctor then? How does, of course, washing hands, we keep hearing that, but when it comes to symptoms, anything that we see, feel, is there something that we should be looking out for?
Well, the online 111 tool is extremely good. It's been set up to deal with this, and I would refer people to that. What we mustn't do is overburden our National Health Service, because we need to ensure that it's there for those who are sickest, and there also for those who have conditions quite apart from coronavirus. So we do need to protect the NHS, and in so doing, protect our own lives. So I think that's vitally important. The number one thing is to stay at home. If we do that, we will flatten the curve and will ensure that we protect our National Health Service and save lives.
Dr. Andrew Morrison, Conservative MP, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, and also that advice, absolutely crucial with any concern, do get in touch with you have a look, with 911 with the NHS online services 111, but it's very important not to overburden them, because we've been seeing so much how hard they have been working. We saw Fergus Walsh's report from an intensive unit. It's just incredible the amount of pressure that our NHS staff are under at this moment. Just returning back to the Prime Minister, that news that Boris Johnson is now in intensive care after that statement that his condition had worsened. He'd been admitted into hospital on Sunday evening to undergo what was described as routine tests. He is now in intensive care. Lots of messages of support for the Prime Minister via social media, on Twitter. Politicians here in the UK, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, saying that her thoughts are with the Prime Minister and his family, and she is sending him very good wishes. The British Chancellor, Rishi Sunak: my thoughts tonight are with Boris Johnson and Carrie Symonds. I know he'll be getting the best care possible and will come out of this even stronger. Of course, important to mention that the Prime Minister's partner is pregnant. Also, the former Chancellor, Sajid Javid, saying Boris is one of the strongest people I know. Certainly something we've been hearing from our guests. Thinking of him, Carrie and his family tonight. Get well soon. The country needs you. There are an awful lot of messages of support for the Prime Minister on social media, and of course for Carrie, his partner as well, who is pregnant. Let's cross over to Westminster. My colleague Chris Mason, our political correspondent, joins us now. Chris, of course, the details just developing. We're only hearing this within the past hour or so. We know that his condition has worsened, but we don't know very many more details than that.
We don't. So a statement from Downing Street around about 40 minutes ago saying that at around about 7 o'clock this evening, so a couple of hours ago, Mr Johnson was moved from where he was within St Thomas's Hospital in central London to the intensive care unit. And the statement fleshes out that the reason for that was that he needed to be in that unit as a precaution should he require ventilation to aid his recovery. And we were told that the Prime Minister is currently conscious. The very fact that Downing Street have had to spell that out gives you some sense of the scale of concern about his condition at the moment and the extent to which it has deteriorated. Because when he was admitted around about 24 hours ago, we were told repeatedly by Downing Street, by his office, that that was because of the persistence of the symptoms he'd been suffering with for some time. In other words, a high temperature and a persistent cough, rather than the development of any additional symptoms. And whilst it's not crystal clear in this statement tonight that he has definitely already developed alternative or other symptoms, clearly there must be a concern about his breathing if they want him closer to equipment that could aid his breathing if that becomes necessary. And they acknowledge in the statement that his condition did worsen, in their words, this afternoon, and so on the advice of his medical team he was moved to the intensive care unit at the hospital. Prior to that happening, he did speak to the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, the First Secretary of State, the de facto deputy to Boris Johnson, asking him to deputise where necessary. So it's leaving open the option there that if he is able to continue to make some decisions or to be involved, I guess, somehow in the business of running the government, then he would want to be as Prime Minister. But clearly, Dominic Raab now being tasked with the day-to-day business of running the government whilst Mr Johnson is in intensive care, which is a very significant development from what the government was saying just a matter of 3 or 4 hours ago at the now daily briefing, which was led by Mr Raab, who was at pains to point out regularly when he was asked repeatedly about the prospect of him assuming the mantle for a period of time, that no, Boris Johnson remained fully in charge. Clearly tonight, that's no longer quite the case.
Chris, during that daily briefing that we heard earlier on today, we did hear Dominic Raab say that he hadn't been in touch or hadn't directly spoken to the Prime Minister since Saturday, and that did actually raise a few eyebrows, given how much the government has been saying that Boris Johnson is in charge. He's been on social media. Even this morning he was saying that his spirits are up. And the vision was that he was very much in charge, but they hadn't been in touch since Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly caught my eye in the news briefing earlier on, that here you have somebody who is the first Secretary of State, and you have a Prime Minister who at the time was saying that he was in regular touch with his ministers and his officials, and yet he hadn't spoken to his most senior minister in Mr Raab since Saturday, which was a full 24 hours at least prior to the point at which Mr Johnson was admitted to hospital. Now, I suppose one could imagine that if Mr Johnson, up until this evening, was able to carry on doing a reasonable amount of work, perhaps he wouldn't speak to every particular minister, and just because he hadn't spoken to Mr Raab didn't mean he hadn't spoken to others. But yeah, that certainly did raise eyebrows amongst us reporting on that news conference, because it would have, on the face of it, been the obvious point of contact that Mr Johnson might have had, had he seen fit, from hospital prior to this moment where he was moved to intensive care.
And Chris, when it comes to the running of the government, yeah, of course, Dominic Raab now will be in charge with this coronavirus response that is taking place across the UK. So we can expect business as usual. We can expect the continuous daily updates that we have got used to getting over the past weeks.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, clearly this is a significant escalation in terms of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's health and the Prime Minister's capacity to do his job. But we know, don't we, from the last 10 days that whilst Boris Johnson has been continuing to work, his capacity to do so has been limited, firstly by the symptoms he's been suffering from, but secondly because he's been in self-isolation. And so, you know, that's involved an adjustment to his working patterns. We haven't seen him doing the news conference, of course, in that period of time. We also know that several senior figures who are part of the coordinating team at the top of government in terms of the national response to this coronavirus crisis have themselves either been diagnosed with it or have had to self-isolate as a result of either symptoms themselves or symptoms within their family. So Professor Chris Whitty, who is the government's chief medical advisor and England's chief medical officer, has only just returned to work out and about in public, away from his home.